The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast. Critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Now, here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. Today I want to do a nightmare case study called the Acidosis Rodeo. This case was actually forwarded to me. I was asked to do a kind of a case review on this, and I found it very, very intriguing. I think there's a lot of amazing teaching points. This is a very complex patient, and there's a lot of things that we can really look at from different angles. And so that's why I named it the Acidosis Rodeo, because there's so many factors that play into our care. I think in the HEMS, or let's say the transport environment in general, I think we are limited in our information. We don't have all the capabilities that maybe an ER has as far as labs. And if you pick up these patients in these small facilities and they haven't had time to draw labs, or for that matter, if they don't have the capabilities to draw certain labs, your information is limited. We also know that a lot of these patients may be ventilator dependent and they have no current ABGs. So in patients that are in severe metabolic acidosis, are we given the proper information to make good clinical decisions? And I think a lot of times we don't have those, telltale labs like an ABG to be able to guide our care. So I think this case is a really, really amazing case. This is going to be a two-part series. There's just so much to look at and to discuss. So I'll break this into two smaller lectures. Before we start, just want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas. I know, it's been an amazing year for us here at FlightBridgeED. I want to thank everybody for just all you've done for allowing us to invest in you and all the support and the emails, and it's been really, really amazing. If you're traveling to AMTC, come check out our booth. We're going to be in booth 832, and myself and Mike Request will be there to greet you. I'd love to meet you. Met a lot of amazing people at the World Expo in New Orleans in October, so real excited to be able to have a booth. We'll have our ventilator book will be on sale at a discounted rate, so come check that out and get a copy for your library. All right, so why don't we jump into this case? Again, the case is a nightmare series case study, the Acidosis Rodeo. We have a 38-year-old male patient. You're called for a transfer. Your flight time, we'll say, is about an hour. When you arrive, you get a report from the referring RN. It states that the patient complained to his family that he had nausea, vomiting, and weakness over the last few days. He does have a medical history of hypertension. You walk into the room, you find him already on the ventilator. He was intubated by the MD. He does have successful intubation with a 7.5 ET tube. It's secured at 23 of the teeth. And so you actually apply end-tidal CO2 capnography, and you have a good waveform. At this point, your capnography waveform CO2 is about 15. And so let's talk about that. What are some things that you're going to look at when you first put a patient on the end-tidal? And you're looking at that end-tidal and it says 15. One of the biggest teaching points that we need to focus on in the critical care environment is, number one, our end-tidal CO2 is our primary source for ET tube placement confirmation and continued monitoring of that ET tube. But we also have to remember that our end-tidal CO2 is the quickest way to identify perfusion. And so we have to be very careful not to get tunnel vision and think about end-tidal as, this is a complete reflection of ventilation, and we've got to keep that between 35 and 45. And so something I came up with last month, I was just thinking about how can we really teach how to look at end-tidal CO2 in the proper ways. And it just kind of came to me. I actually put this on Twitter and had a lot of good feedback on this. And it's called the 3 Ps. And so whenever you have a low end-tidal CO2, so we'll say an end-tidal less than 35, the first thing that you want to think of, does the patient have a pulse, right? So the 3 Ps, pulse. Number 2, what's their perfusion status? I haven't told you the blood pressure yet, but what's the perfusion status? Do we have a low blood pressure? Because remember, that measurement is based on blood flow. And if we don't have good blood flow, we essentially have a moderate dead space ventilation situation. We have a stagnant hypoxia per se. Then that measurement can't take place. And so your measurement of end-tidal CO2 and that number is directly related to our ability for perfusion and ultimate cardiac output. And number 3 is, what is your pH? All right, so pulse, perfusion, pH. Those are the first 3 things that you always think of anytime you hear of a low end-tidal CO2, whether this is in a testing situation, whether this is a real patient situation. Always think of those 3 things. Does my patient have a pulse? What's my perfusion status? And what's my pH? And we're going to kind of break those down as we go. So you look at the ventilator on this patient and you identify the patient is in assist control volume, tidal volume of 500, rate of 22, PEEP of 5. The referring RN actually tells you that they have got blood gases. Blood gases are about 30 minutes old, and you have a current pH of 6.97. You have a CO2 of 17, a bicarb of 5, and a base deficit of negative 23. Or I should say a base deficit of 23. It's a base excess of negative 23. So based on that, right, we said the end-tidal CO2 was 15. So let's remember a few rules when we talk about end-tidal CO2 and we compare that to your PCO2 on your blood gas. The first rule is your end-tidal CO2 will always be the lowest number out of the 2. So that means that if your end-tidal is 15, your PCO2 has to be at least 16, but it could be 100, right? So always remember your end-tidal is your lowest number. And that's the true measurement of how we're going to monitor our patients. That's how you can really titrate your ventilation strategies to affect pH, is by kind of understanding that concept. Now, without really knowing the gradient for each patient, the textbook kind of answer is the end-tidal and the PCO2 are going to be about 3 to 5 millimeters of mercury difference from each other. So always kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But again, based on what's going on, based on shunt, dead space ventilation, all those things, that gradient could be a lot wider. So we have a CO2 of 17 on our blood gas. We have an end-tidal CO2 of 15. So there's something that we can do, and we can identify, all right, this patient is in a severe metabolic acidosis. It's actually, if we really label this ABG, we have a 6.9 pH, we have a CO2 of 17, a bicarb of 5. And so that would be if we used our first and last name mnemonic, right? Your first name is either compensated or uncompensated. And so if the pH falls between 7.35 and 7.45, we're compensated. If it falls outside of that, we're uncompensated. So we're definitely outside of that realm. So the first name is uncompensated. The next thing we're going to look at is the last name. And the last name, again, is still looking at just the pH. Are we less than 7.35 or are we greater than 7.45? Truly, the textbook method is if you're less than 7.40, which is a perfect pH, that's an acid. If you're greater than 7.41, or I should say greater than 7.4, so 7.41, that is a base or an alkalosis. I think we commonly look at that if it's less than 7.35, which is out of that compensated range, and that's where we're going to kind of look at this as a more pathologic finding. So This patient, based on the first name, is uncompensated, and the last name is an acidosis. So we already know we have an uncompensated acidosis just based on the pH. Then we look at the respiratory side. The respiratory side is your CO2. We know our CO2 should fall between 35 and 45 with a perfect CO2 of 40. And we also know that CO2 is what's called a frank acid. And a frank acid just meaning that this is a acid. And so if you have a high amount of CO2, then that means that you have a buildup of acid. If you have a low amount of CO2, that means you have a greater amount of base. So in normal compensation, your CO2 and your bicarb related to acid and base should always move opposite. Okay? So if we go down to our bicarb norm is 22 to 26. And we know that's a base. So if you had a greater than 26 bicarb, that means you have a higher amount of base. If you have a lower than 22 bicarb, that means you have a low amount of base, which means you have a high amount of acid. So if you're kind of following me here, if our normal compensation for our body is to always have our CO2 and our bicarb moving opposite of each other, right? That's normal compensation. And we said our bicarb right now is 5. And if it's less than 22, that means you have a low amount of base, and that means it's a high amount of acid, causing that bicarb to be low. Your CO2, if your CO2 is high, that would mean you have a high amount of acid. So that would mean that those were moving the same direction, and that would be more of a mixed disturbance. But in this patient, your pH is 6.97, your CO2 is 17. And so it's less than 35. That means you have a low amount of acid on the respiratory side. So that is truly moving opposite as it relates to bicarb. So your CO2 is showing more of a base, and your bicarb is showing more of an acid. So they're moving opposite. And so just based on that, we label this blood gas as a partially compensated metabolic acidosis because our CO2, our respiratory side, is compensating. Remember, we have two primary compensations that take place either second by second or minute by minute. We have our primary, which is our carbonic acid buffering system. And we know that 95% of the O2 that we bring in for gas exchange actually converts to water. And that water, that H2O, is actually utilized in the electron transport chain for your ATP production in aerobic metabolism, but it's also used in the carbonic acid buffering system. And so we have areas of our body, right, all of our muscles in particular, that have a very high amount of acid, a lot of CO2 that's built up that needs to be metabolized. And what happens is that water, that O2 converts to water, and that water, that H2O, combines with CO2 and forms carbonic acid. The carbonic acid is then disassociated and converted to hydrogen and bicarb, and that's how we metabolize CO2. So that's happening second by second. And then your lungs kind of come in, and this is more of a minute by minute, and it will actually, regulate the amount of carbonic acid in an attempt to hold on to or blow off, metabolize more CO2. So we need to understand that this ABG, that this patient is very sick, that this is a very critical ABG. But we also need to understand how much more can this patient compensate on the respiratory side. And so there's a really cool formula that they can do. It's very quick. And it basically identifies the max compensation on the respiratory side. And that's always based on the bicarb. All right? And so what we do is we take 1.5. 1.5 is a stationary number. It never changes. So 1.5 times your bicarb. And so we'll say 1.5 times your bicarb. Your bicarb was 5. And then you add 8 to it. So 1.5 times the bicarb plus 8 equals 15.5. So that means based on this patient's bicarb, their full maximum respiratory compensation to protect that pH is 15.5 on their CO2. And we're already at 17. So the patient really is almost maxed out on respiratory compensation. if this patient starts getting worse clinically and their pH starts dropping further, our patient is not going to have the ability to increase their respiratory compensation much more to protect that pH. Why is that important? Because remember, there's a relationship between our CO2 and our pH. So for every 10 points we increase or decrease on our CO2, we have an opposite change by 0.08 on our pH. So if your CO2 on this patient on your end tidal went from 15 to 25, that means that your pH would drop by 0.08. So you would actually have a pH that's in the 6.8 range just based on that. So it's important to know that this patient's maxed out on respiratory compensation. So we have to be able to match their compensation, and we may even increase their respiratory compensation, but utilize the mechanical ventilator for that purpose. All right. So if we continue on the blood gas, we can also see that the patient's PO2, right, the amount of oxygen dissolved in the plasma is 102. And we know a normal PO2 is 80 to 100. And so that is reflective of a normal PO2. All right, so let's look at other labs really quick. Some other labs that we always want to focus on when we look at an acidosis is what is the patient's sodium and chloride? We know that both of those are strong acids, and they have a direct effect on acid-base balance. And so a sodium for this patient is 126, and a chloride is 80. So 126 and a chloride is 80. So we know that both of those seem low, right? We know that our standard sodium is 135 to 145, and our normal chloride is going to be, 95 to 105 area, somewhere in that range. So we need to identify why do we have a lower sodium. And one of the things we have to remember is in a hyperglycemic patient, this patient has a really high sugar. And this patient's sugar is 1,034, right? So we'll get into different causes of a high sugar. Differential diagnosis, is this a hyperosmolar, an HHNK, or is this a DKA patient? But anytime you have a high sugar, we have to understand the physiology behind that. In a hyperglycemia, this causes an osmotic shift of water basically from that intercellular area to that extracellular area. So this causes a dilutional hyponatremia. When we look at that, we see, all right, a sodium of 126, right? It's not critically low, but we really don't want it to drop anymore. And so what you need to do is what's called a corrected sodium. And there's a corrected sodium formula that we can kind of identify, all right, is this sodium low because of the sugar, or does this patient truly have a dilutional hyponatremia? And so the formula goes like this, is you take basically have two parentheses, and what I'll do is I'll put this in the show notes for everybody if you want to pull this up. You take your glucose, you subtract 100 from that. So this patient's glucose was 1,034, subtract 100, so our answer is 934. You take that 934 and you multiply it by 0.016, and that's going to give you 14.94. And then you add the patient's sodium on the lab. So we have 14.94. You add that to 126, and the corrected sodium is 140.9. So basically what we just did is we identified that because the glucose is so high, it actually truly caused that osmotic shift, and it caused a dilutional hyponatremia. So if we basically think about this as intracellular shifting of positively and negatively charged cations and ions, that's all we have basically. And so we just corrected our sodium and we identified we truly have a proper sodium level. It's just shifted based on that high blood sugar. If we continue on the labs reflected a potassium of 8.4. And we have to remember that potassium is a big deal. When it gets high like that, we have to always kind of think about why is it high? But we also have to kind of think from the perspective of do no harm. And we don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction to a high K. Again, based on just shifting in and out of the cell, because when we become acidotic, we shift hydrogen ions into the cell, and we can only have so many positively charged cations. And so something's got to give. And so that potassium gets pushed outside the cell into the bloodstream. So our serum blood potassium level will shoot up. So the key thing is to remember in a metabolic acidosis, you're going to have a high potassium. That's something you should see. You should see that. And if you don't see that, then that kind of should be alarming, because that's going to be more of a situation where once that metabolic acidosis is corrected and you had, let's say, a potassium less than 5, that shouldn't be that way. You should have a higher potassium in a metabolic acidosis. So if you corrected that metabolic acidosis in that patient with a K less than 5, you're going to drop that K even further. And so in those patients, you would actually start hanging potassium and administer potassium during transport just to protect that and make sure that you don't have any sudden drop in K. So the rule with potassium is you can drop the potassium fast, but you can't raise it up fast. And so any low potassium, and really for the transport environment, and I've talked to a few physicians on this, whether that number is 5, whether that number is 4, I really think that if it's less than 5 in a metabolic acidosis with a pH this low like this, you need to start potassium immediately. So when do we treat a high K in a metabolic acidosis? Well, things to think about is, do you have any effects on the heart? Are you seeing any clinical signs on your EKG? Are you seeing those peaked T waves? Are you seeing any irritability? Are you seeing PVCs? If you're not, start treating the underlying cause, and that K will start dropping down. If for whatever reason you decide to treat the potassium, or you go into a transfer like this and the physician has started treating the patient for this high potassium, remember that there's multiple medications in this treatment algorithm that we have to understand, right? And so they're going to give calcium chloride or calcium gluconate. And the reason why they give that is this essentially raises the action potential threshold. They're going to give sodium bicarb. We know sodium bicarb raises the pH, and again, it also raises the electrical gradient, essentially. They're going to give D50. Why would they give D50? Well, they give D50 because it's a transport molecule. It needs that sugar molecule to basically transport the potassium across the cell membrane back into the cell. And so based on the insulin administration, for every amp of D50, they're going to give 5 to 10 units of insulin on top of that. And so again, insulin also moves the dextrose molecule across the cell membrane, and it causes that shifting of potassium back into the cell. And then the last one you may see is albuterol. Albuterol, again, is a beta agonist, and so it causes that beta stimulation. That beta stimulation is going to allow a potassium to attach to it, and it pushes the potassium back in the cell. So you can see that a lot of these different medications are carrier molecules. They actually help transport that potassium back across that cell membrane. All right, so further on the labs, this patient's BUN and creatinine were 39 and creatinine a 2, and so we know that both of those are high. And so at this point, based on the history, really no clinical history of acute renal failure, but this would be classified as an acute renal failure patient. We know from the initial clinical presentation this patient had excessive thirst, vomiting, and weakness, so right, a lot of volume loss potentially. And then we get into our white blood cells, right? Is there an infectious process going on? A lot of times, you want to rule that out. Is that the cause of this blood sugar increase? Or is, which one started first? And so this patient had a white blood cell count of 25,000. So very, very high. What are some things that we can look at from the perspective of, all right, now our white count is 25,000. Do we have an infectious process? And we know that lactate is one of those things that we've used for quite a long time. If you're new to the critical care environment or you're working at a small facility where they don't draw lactates, we've learned a lot about lactates. There's some amazing researchers in the world that really study lactate and the importance of lactate, what it truly means. We essentially know, though, that lactate is a byproduct of both aerobic and anaerobic process. And lactate is an essential fuel that our brain and our heart needs. It utilizes it every single second. And so I think the misconception that we have, or I should say we see, or I see when I teach, is that lactate is an indicator of tissue hypoxia. And they've shown that that is not the case, that in normal glycolysis, aerobic glycolysis, we produce lactate. And again, we produce lactate for that essential fuel source that our brain and our heart needs. And so what they know now is that lactate is an indicator of stress. If we kind of go into the whole process of ATP production, that production starts from a glycogen molecule that converts to glucose. Well, that glycogen is stored in our liver, and our liver releases the glycogen based on beta-2 stimulation. And so if you think about our sympathetic response or sympathetic surge, or even patients that are given medications that have a beta-2 property, if it is administered, think about how that's going to stimulate beta-2 secretion of glycogen. And so we have to understand that the stress response associated with our disease process is going to increase our lactate levels. And so this is still a very useful tool to identify, do we have a patient that is in a severe stress response? Do they have a lactate level that's greater than 2.5 with an associated acidosis? If they do, if it's greater than 4, some labs may say 5, but we'll say 4 for this podcast, and they have an associated acidosis, that's significant. And so then it's looked at more of a severity of disease process. Like, how sick really is this patient? And they're going to be looking at that lactate and wanting to see that lactate level drop down. If we start intervening in this disease process and we get ahead of the game, we start delivering the proper amounts of oxygen, we start treating the underlying cause, and we get ahead of the game, then the body's stress response will actually decrease. And that will hopefully now then drop our lactate production. So that's a very useful tool to kind of help guide us as far as severity goes. There's another lab that's kind of fairly new. I'm not seeing it drawn a lot. I am seeing it drawn in this location. It's called procalcitonin. And procalcitonin is an excellent lab that indicates a high probability of sepsis. Essentially a higher likelihood of bacterial cause of the symptoms. And so you can look at this from the perspective of a very mild to moderate infection or an inflammatory response. If you have, just maybe a mild increase in procalcitonin, or if you have a pretty significant increase in procalcitonin, then it's diagnostic for a bacterial sepsis. Your normal levels for procalcitonin is going to be anything less than 0.15 nanograms per milliliter. When you get in between 0.15 to 2 nanograms per milliliter, that's going to be significant for a moderate bacterial infection or an inflammatory response. if you are greater than 2 nanograms per milliliter, that's diagnostic for a bacterial sepsis, or should give you that high index of suspicion that there's a bacterial component to this patient's underlying disease process. All right, if we continue with the labs, the patient has a hemoglobin of 11 and a hematocrit of 43, so an H&H of 11 and 43. Not really anything significant, nothing that I'm going to worry about at this point. So you're given a report, and you're told that the patient's insulin drip is at 15 units per hour. All right, so how much insulin do we give? How big is this patient? We'll say this patient is 70 kilos. So you have a 70 kilo patient. How much insulin is too much? Should we be worrying about an insulin drip in transport? And so here's some things I want you to kind of consider. Our ability to gauge and monitor continuous capillary blood glucose or serum glucose is very limited. Our glucose monitors will only read high, or I should say they will read high when your sugar is greater than 600. So this patient has a sugar of 1,034, I thought I said. So 1,034, and they have the patient on an insulin drip of 15 units per hour. We have a 70 kilo patient. So your standard insulin drip dosage is actually 0.5 units per kilo per hour. So this patient is getting double the insulin dose as far as the drip per hour than they should be, right? And I see this all the time. These small facilities, it seems like they're overdosing these patients on insulin. And this is a big, big deal. So remember, a few core teaching points is you should never drop your sugar more than 100 per hour or more than 50 in 30 minutes, right? We want a very slow drop with our sugar. That kind of brings up the argument of why are we even worrying about it in transport? We have no way of identifying. If this patient's sugar on the lab was 1,034 and our blood glucose monitors only show high with a sugar of greater than 600, then you basically have a 400-point spread there where you have no idea what your sugar is. And so what if during transport you continued with this insulin drip? Even if you dropped it down to 7 units per kilo per hour, like it should be, right? It right now is at 15 units. What if your sugar dropped 300 points in that hour of transport? Remember, that will cause a cerebral edema, right? We don't want that. That could kill your patient. So I think the key is if your sugar is less than 600, I think it's appropriate to continue with the insulin drip, but you need to make sure your insulin drip is correct. You need to make sure that it's dose correct for this patient, and you need to really watch that blood sugar. Remember, no more than 100 per hour or 50 in 30 minutes. And so for this patient, I think needs to have the insulin drip turned completely off. It's not really a concern during transport to even drop the sugar. Let the ICU do that, where they can do it in a very therapeutic, slow process where they can monitor the sugars and really take a close look at how they're treating the patient. We really don't have that ability in transport. All right. Do a couple more things and then we'll stop for part one. The last thing I want to kind of focus on for part one is, what do you do when you don't have an ABG? Right? This is such a critical patient. If we don't manage this patient correctly as far as minute ventilation goes and making sure we're protecting their compensation, how do we kind of look at that from a perspective of, man, we just don't have the information. How do we know? Well, there's a couple really easy ways to identify metabolic acidosis. So I'm going to go through a few of them. Based on this patient's ABG and labs, it shows that they had an anion gap of 49. All right, that's a massive anion gap. Remember that in a corrected anion gap calculation, we're going to go through that here in a second, anything greater than 20 is indicative or showing that they have a metabolic acidosis. So this patient has an anion gap of 49. So how do we identify an anion gap? Well, most places, if they don't have an ABG, at least they're going to have a Chem 9, right? They're going to have your Chem panel. You're going to have your hematology studies and stuff like that. So all you need your chloride and your bicarb. Now remember, your bicarb on your Chem 9 is your CO2. Okay, I'll say that again. Your bicarb on your Chem 9 panel is actually your CO2. So whatever that CO2 is, you use that as your bicarb. It's the same thing. So it's going to be chloride plus your bicarb. Take that number, subtract it from your current sodium, and then add your potassium. All right, so let's do that. So we said that your bicarb, or your CO2 on your labs, was 3 on the Chem 9. Your chloride was 80. So 80 plus 3 is 83. All right, so now we need to take that 83 and need to subtract that from your sodium. So your sodium was 126 minus 83. And then you need to add that to your potassium of 8. So 126 minus 83 is 43. And then we need to add our potassium. And our potassium was, we'll just round it down to 8 make the math easy. And so 43 plus 8 is 51. So based on that calculation, your anion gap is 51. So you can see that it came out just a couple points different from the actual ABG anion gap calculation, or I should say the lab's calculation that was given to me. There's another way you can do this, and this is a quick way, is you just take the number 24. 24 is always the same, right? It never changes. It's kind of that same number that is unchanged by anything. And you subtract the bicarb, or again, the CO2 on that Chem 9 panel. So again, the CO2 is what you're going to use in place of bicarb. So 24 minus the CO2 on the Chem 9. 24 minus 3, remember 3 was your CO2, is 21. And what that does is that gives you a predicted base deficit, or a quick base deficit without an ABG. And so your base deficit, based on just the 24 minus what your CO2 was on your Chem 9, came out to 21. If we go back to our ABG, and remember our base deficit on our ABG was 23. So again, we were only a couple points off. And so that's another really quick way that you can identify a metabolic acidosis, right? So we know that a base deficit is a negative base excess. All right, so I'll say that again. So your base excess on your ABG will say base excess plus or minus 2. And so if we're talking about base, and we're talking about an excess amount of base, it would be a positive number if you had an alkalosis. If you had an acidosis, it would be a negative number. And so that's where you say, or you call it, a base deficit. And so this base deficit is negative 21, essentially. It means you have 21 acids that are causing that pH to be 6.9 or whatever it was, 6.96. And so that's another really quick way that you can say, you know what, I don't have an ABG, but I can do an anion gap calculation, and I can really quickly take 24, subtract it from your Chem 9's CO2, and if it's basically greater than 2, then you have a metabolic acidosis. So you know that this base deficit on this patient is negative 29. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to stop for part 1, and then we're going to kind of get into the treatment kind of modality, differential diagnosis, talk a little bit about DKA and your hyperosmolar HHNK type patient, and we'll wrap it up. So I hope you enjoyed this. I know this is a complex case. There's a lot going on. I will put notes in the show notes to where you can kind of print this off and work through these problems so you can practice. And again, I want to thank you for just following us and making this such a successful venture. Very, very enjoyable for me to keep seeing all the emails and all the people that have been so kind with the comments. It's been amazing. So until next time, I will talk to you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education. For more, visit FlightBridgeED.com.